Go on YouTube. So yesterday's video was received very well. Got a lot of supportive comments from people telling me I should do more content like this. So I figured I'd go ahead and move forward with another idea of something I'd been wanting to talk about for a while, which is a sort of comparison between my two favorite formats, which are Tengu plant format and Edison format. Now, I of course predominantly play Edison format, mostly because Edison format is just the most popular format right now. I guess maybe Goat's comparable, but I don't really like Goat as much. These two formats are more like my era, I guess, and they get brought up in comparisons a lot because of the popular retro formats. They're probably the most similar. Like Goat is like way off in the past with all this DM nonsense, and Hat formats more distant future with stuff like Soul Charge and a lot more, Dragon Rulers, some more modern-ish type of cards. But these two formats are like a year apart, right in Synchro era. It's a time in the game where there was a big spike in popularity of the competitive scene and the popularity of Yugi tubing in general. It's right around when Dueling Network came out as well. So it was just a very transformative time in the game, and I think there's a lot of nostalgia for that era, which is why you see formats like this getting more popular, especially Edison. But the formats get compared a lot. They're pretty similar card pool, very similar play style. They're sort of between this like slower DM era, type of gameplay that Goat is, with a really inbred card pool, and between that and then the more modern stuff where gameplay just completely changes and ceases to be about card advantage or back and forth for the most part. I mean, these are generalizations, of course. There's exceptions, and it's not exactly as simple as the way I spelled it out, but it's kind of this fun in-between era that I really like. And they're both right in there. A lot of similar cards. They're both definitive Synchro era formats, so they get compared a lot. Now, I almost made this into like some clickbait video of we're going to determine which one of these formats is better, but I ultimately decided against that for a couple reasons. Like, first of all, no answer I give is going to please people. Like, if I say one format's better, I'm going to piss off a bunch of people, and if I come up with some dumb fence-sitting answer, then that's just going to piss off everyone. So rather than approaching it from that angle, I'm just going to kind of compare and contrast the pros and cons in and of themselves without doing some sort of final math decision where I add up points and say, oh, Tengu format is 5% worse than Edison format, that's just seems a little bit silly. I think the formats are pretty similar, pretty comparable, and a lot of the judgments that you're going to make about them are going to have to be subjective. But there are some categories that I'm going to be considering and just talking about in today's video. So I think now that we've prefaced this extremely long intro, let's just jump into the first category, which is the ban list slash card pool. We're just going to be talking about cards and ratios between the different formats. Mainly, we're going to be focusing on just a few different ones that I picked out as super important. First, we're going to talk about actually these two that you see in the bottom right. These two are legal in both formats, and everyone hates them. Trap Dust Shoot and Future Fusion. These are just two of the sackiest cards in the entire game in this time period, with, of course, Future Fusion in Dragons being able to just give you some absurd +1 crazy combo turn on turn 1, and Trap Dust Shoot essentially just ending the game. Now, I will say, I think these two cards are a little bit worse in Tengu format for the game than they are in Edison. They're really bad in both formats. When I say a little bit, I mean they're 10% worse. If you open them in Edison, you're 90% guaranteed to just win the duel on turn 1, where if you open them in Tengu, you're 95% or something. It's like a slight difference, and I'm not really sure what it is. I think maybe it's just because the format is faster and more consistent in general, whereas if you just draw these insane power cards, you can just win right off the bat even more often. But they're both just super toxic, and they're in both formats. So, it's just kind of something that we got to acknowledge before we talk about, degenerate cards that are legal in formats. Two of the biggest degenerate cards are actually just legal in both and just mess up both formats. But now that we got that out of the way, let's actually start talking about the differences here. So let's start with Edison. The major gripes that I have with the Edison ban list are right here at the top, which is Substitoad at 3. Now, this isn't really a mistake necessarily. I think like the Frog FTK sort of stuff. The problem with this card just hadn't really been discovered yet, really, over in the TCG. So I guess Konami just didn't know. But this is one of the most degenerate cards ever printed. Like, there's a lot of people in Edison who are probably a little too attached to the Frog deck that try to portray this like Ronin Totem was the card that broke Frog F. And no. Substitoad is definitively the poorly designed problem card in this situation. And, like, the fact that it's legal in Edison is very not okay. Like, there is this Frog FTK combo deck. It's not, like, super crazy good or anything in Edison, but it's playable, and it is extremely toxic, and it is only because of Substitoad. And also just, like, Frog plays in general, Substitoad are annoyingly overpowered. Like, just getting to thin through your entire deck, it synergizes with Solex, you can just, like, end on dupe block for free. It's just kind of dumb. And this card in general is just super poorly designed, super poorly thought out, extremely degenerate, one of the worst things that they ever printed. And it's just at 3. It's just like, there's just 3 of this thing, and it's searchable with 1-for-1. So, I mean, very, very questionable ban list decision. Well, not really decision, I guess, because they didn't really know about it, but it's super awkward that this card is allowed. And I think a lot of people would prefer if it wasn't, but it's just kind of the way it is. We just kind of have to deal with it. And yeah, Substitoad, not okay. Of course, by the time we got to Tengu format, Frog FTK already happened, and Konami realized that this card was not okay, and it got banned. So not really an issue over there. There's a lot of things I kind of excluded from this list, like Avarice and Fishborg Blaster. I felt like they just weren't that important. I guess by the time you get to Tengu format, Fishborg in itself is a really degenerate card because of Formula Synchron. But in Edison, we don't have that. So it's like kind of not such a big deal having Fishborg in itself. It's mainly just Substitoad, really, in Edison format. I think that is the problem in that weird Frog FDK deck. Like, people try to blame it on Exodius, the ultimate Forbidden Lord, and shit. It's just like, what? Exodius? What the hell did this card do? It's literally, it is Substitoad, okay? There's nothing else. There's not Ronin Totem, it's not Exodius, it's not Fishborg Blaster, it's not Pot of Avarice, it is Substitoad and nobody else. It is only Substitoad's fault. So, okay, I've ranted enough about Substitoad. So, Substitoad versus no Substitoad, you would obviously rather have no Substitoad. Anyway, in terms of the spell trap removal lineup, I think this is also much healthier in Tengu Plant. They just have, like, Storm plus triple Space Typhoon, whereas in Edison you have 1 Space Typhoon, which is just, it's just too, like, Space Typhoon should never have been at 1. I mean, we need to acknowledge this fact. Like, this card never needed to be at, like, less than 2, I think. MST is a perfectly fair, healthy, just 1-for-1 piece of removal. It's totally fine at like 2 or 3. At 3, people don't even play it at 3. Why was this card limited for so long? It's just, like, a very healthy card for the game. For so long, we were in this situation where, like, every Floodgate ever had to get, like, hit on the list. Like, level limit area B and shit. And it's just, like, because they didn't want to put MST at more copies, and I don't get why. But, in, like, the substitute that we have for this in Edison format is we have these insanely sacky, like, Cold Wave and Giant Trunade cards that nobody likes. Like, they're not even really good. They're mostly just used for, like, degenerate crap, like Cold Wave into Cat into whatever GB or X-Saber nonsense. Like, if you draw it, it's a win the game button in certain decks. And it's just, they're super annoying. Trunade only used for OTKs and dumb shit. These 2 cards are just nothing good is ever associated with them. And you would just much rather have more MSTs. I think MST is way better. It answers Floodgates too, which is another thing. Like, just very, very easy outs to stuff like Royal Oppression would probably be a lot less of a problem in the format if we just had a bunch of Space Typhoons running around. But instead, we have Cold Wave and Giant Trunade, which most decks don't even play, and the decks that do play it are just, like, super annoying, you know? So, I would say the general spell trap removal staple lineup is a lot better for the game in Tengu Plant than it is in Edison. Anyway, let's start comparing card to card. So, like, the Saki top deck cards, Brain Control versus Monster Reborn. These are both kind of obnoxious. In most situations, like, each of them is relatively harmless, I guess, if you just look at it in practice. Like, Brain Control is usually just a piece of removal. Monster Reborn is usually just a generic extender. But, like, sometimes you just win the game if you draw these in the late game, you know? Like, sometimes you just get to win because you drew them. They're both pretty objectionable in that way, but at the same time, probably not as objectionable as some of the other cards on this list. They're just kind of really obnoxious Saki power cards that are... They mostly, like, come up as problems when you're in some kind of top decking war in games that are really close. And then you just automatically win because you drew, like, Monster Reborn or Brain Control in a game that otherwise probably would have grinded on for a bit longer. But it's hard to really say. I guess it would be better for both formats if they just didn't exist, probably. But that's all I'm really going to say about that. Next, we've got to talk about BLS. This is probably the single worst banlist choice in Tengu format. This card needed to wait until, like, Duelist Alliance era or something to come back. Like, that Arc 5 period of power creep, like, I guess BLS was probably okay to come back then. Before that, BLS was just absurdly strong, just way, way too good to come back, ever. And this thing came back, like, years before it was ready to come back. I mean, as a boss monster, it is just obscene. It completely, like, power creeps every other boss monster that's around. It just ends the game when it comes down. It's so crazy. It's so Saki. It's so absurd. It's gotta be the worst part of the Tengu format ban list. Like, this thing just is not okay. This thing is not okay. And that's really all there is to it. I mean, there's just no way to justify BLS. The card is absurd. The card is ridiculous. It was banned for a long time for a reason. It should have stayed banned much longer for a reason. All right, next point of comparison is Royal Oppression versus Maxi. Now, there's a lot of people... I kind of go back and forth on Maxi. There's a lot of people out there who probably started playing the game, like, a lot more recently, who have this view that Maxi was always as toxic as it was from, like, 2015 onward, and that's not really true. Like, both these cards are kind of similar in the sense that, like, their respective formats are so warped around them that people just, like, don't even main them because everyone's just going to be playing around them and building their decks around them. So they're just, like, sideboard cards for certain matchups for the most part, which is kind of funny given how overpowered they are. But if I had to choose, I would say in the context of this era, Royal Oppression is worse. There's just... Maxi at least gives you, like, decisions. Like, you can just end your turn, and that's okay a lot of the times, which is something that's not true in more modern formats. You can just, like, do part of your combo and, like, give yourself a plus and give them a plus. You can take the challenge and try to win. I mean, with Royal Oppression, it's just like a button that says you can't play the game. And the game is sufficiently fast at this point where it's like every deck worth playing just loses to Royal Oppression pretty much. So, like, it's not really fair, you know? It's just an absurd floodgate. So I would say Oppression's probably the more degenerate of these two options. So, I mean, if we're really looking at it in totality, at least of these, like, few things that I've narrowly picked out, it probably looks like there's no way to argue that Edison format doesn't have more objectionable ban list decisions. But I'd say the two are pretty comparable overall. There are a few differences, like I mentioned here, but I maybe give the edge to Tengu format in terms of just, like, the ban list, because I feel like there is a lot more. Konami really, like, figured out a lot of the, like, long time suspect cards in this time period by the time we got to 2011, whereas in 2010 a lot of them were still allowed, is my general view on this. But I mean, obviously Dust Shoot is by far and away the most absurd of any of these, and it's still legal in 2011, so if anything, that's a pretty big takeaway there. Like, they took way too long to ban Dust Shoot. Like, let's just think about the fact that this thing didn't get banned till like, what was it, Dino Rabbit format or something? Like, I think it was in 2012 sometime. But Dust Shoot, I hate it. I hate most of these cards. But yeah, probably Tengu format's ban list is a little more like well thought out and balanced overall. Next, we're going to be talking about diversity and top decks. Now, this is probably the single most important category to me. I want the format to be diverse because I'm someone who likes to play crazy stuff. I want the decks that are good in a format to be cool because I want gameplay to be fun. So, these are the sort of top tier 1 decks of both formats, not based on my opinion, but just based on what's like categorized as competitive in both of the respective like Discord servers. Like, for example, I would definitely not put Hero Beat or Gladiator Beast as tier 1 decks in Edison format, and I would probably not put Sabers or Karakuris as tier 1 decks in Tengu format, but in general, the overall sense seems to be that probably there's a greater number of competitive decks in Edison format, but by which I mean like tier 1 decks. I'd say there's probably like a dozen or so, whereas in Tengu format, we kind of have to mention as well, Tengu format's a bit less developed than Edison. It's not as popular. People haven't been playing it as much. So there seems to be like half a dozen or so like top tier decks, but it could ultimately end up being more as the format is played. Because a lot of times people return to a format, right? And they just play like historical lists or whatever they played back in the day. So people will just pick up like Agents or Tengu Plants and play it again. So like this list on the left could definitely grow longer over time. You could definitely see that happening. But I think, based on my experience playing both formats, Edison's probably a bit more diverse. In terms of the decks that are good, like, there are trade-offs here. I think there are, like, a lot more helmety sort of decks that are good in Edison format. So, like, Blackwings, for example, being one of the best decks, like, probably the best. It's debatable, maybe, but one of the best for sure. I think there's more stuff like that just because the format in general is a bit slower and set heavier. There's a lot less consistency, a lot less extenders. Oppression exists. It's just like there's more decks like this. But the trade off to that is because Tengu format is combo-ier and they have like triple skill drain and stuff, and Road's even better because of Dark Hole. This means that like just full-on stun decks are playable in Tengu format, whereas in Edison, like stun just gets gatekept by Blackwings every time. Like there's no playable stun deck in Edison format. Was TG stun and whatnot and other like skill drain beat stun decks are basically viable in Tengu format. For sure, TG stun has to be tier 1. Malefic skill drain maybe probably not, but Gravekeepers, who knows? Probably not either. But like these decks are playable in Tengu format at the very least. And in Edison format, if you try to turn up with some dumb like banish stun, whatever, you're just gonna get run over by birds or something, you know? It's just like not gonna work. So, but then again, we also have to consider, and this is a big one, that Gladiator Beast is playable in Tengu or in Edison format. Like it's not great, but you can play it without just getting destroyed. Whereas in Tengu format, Gladiator Beast is pure 100,000% copium, and it's like tier 4 garbage, and you should throw it away and buy an agent structure deck, for God's sake. I mean, so that's got to be a big consideration for me, especially. Overall, there are really cool decks, though, that are quite good in both formats. I think most of the best decks in both formats are quite cool in terms of their playstyle. I mean, I love Agents, I love Chaos, I love Tengu Plant, and all of the related decks. Karakuris are cool. In Edison, we got Fairies, which are really neat. Quick draw decks are cool. Zombies, one of the best decks. Very, very cool playstyle. So, I mean, they're pretty comparable in terms of like the deck types that are good for me. I think there are a lot of cool decks that are good in both formats, and that's generally the takeaway. I think Edison's a bit more diverse. I feel like the power level difference between the best decks and not the best decks is a bit smaller in Edison format. I really feel a bit more like I can just turn up with whatever jank and do well in Edison format. So I gotta give Edison the edge in this very important category in terms of like the diversity and the cool decks. I don't know if I could pull it off in, well, actually I have pulled it off in Tengu form, huh? Well, maybe I should change my opinion on that, but I think overall I'm gonna give Edison format the edge in the category of just cool decks of diversity, and definitely the most important category there. So a big W there for you Edison fans. Anyway, on to the final little discussion of this video, which is going first. Now, this is something that I feel like I've never heard anyone mention, but I think going first in Edison format is like relatively insane compared to going first in other retro formats. Like, I've played like GOAT format, Hat format, Tengu format, Edison format. I've played a lot of, and a few like in between formats in that era, in those respective eras. And I've never played a format where I felt like going first was as good as it is in Edison. There are a couple potential reasons that occur to me for this. First of all, Edison is just slower and less consistent, which leads to people like supplementing decks with lots of back row. Like generally, even just the average deck in Edison plays like 12 back row or something, which is a bit crazy. So just going first and having that momentum of getting to set your cards in a much set heavier format. Like there's people play like flip monsters and stuff too still. So like Raiko's super predominant even still. So like going first just feels crazy in Edison to me. And like frogs are insane going first as well. Like a lot better going first than going second. So I just feel like there's more of an advantage to going first in Edison. And in Tengu format, we have to consider also that there's like later on we get more hand traps, right? We get like Valor Maxi. In Edison, we basically just have Crow, which you can't really get away with main decking multiple DD Crows. It's not good against enough stuff. Whereas you can definitely main deck like Valors at the very least in later on formats. So it's like you have these other options in terms of going second in later formats. Plus the format gets faster, which means there's just like more you can do in a turn. So even if your normal summon gets screwed over by a back row, you might just be able to extend and play into it. So it just kind of leads to a situation where where Edison format is in this awkward in between spot between like older formats where you're not just gonna lose because you get off to a slow start because the format's just slower, and these newer formats where you have more options and sort of ways of dealing with the lost momentum of going second. But that's just kind of my opinion on that. I don't know. I've never really heard anyone mention this, so maybe other people feel differently on this. In general, I think something I have to mention that I think I've mentioned before is that drawing for turn on turn one was always bad game design, and like I'm glad Konami changed it, but there's this narrative out there that they like needed to change it for modern, and like this just needed to always be the rule. Like there's no reason why having the like momentum of going first should also be coupled with having the card advantage of being +1. It doesn't make sense. Like even if let's say the case we change this rule and then going second is just definitively the best. Like going second and having the extra card will never be as better as going first and having the extra card. So it's like this being the way it is made the die roll so much more important than it needed to be, just for no reason whatsoever. But yeah, I'd say the fact that going first feels better in Edison is definitely a disadvantage. I would rather have a format where die roll isn't as important. I don't think anyone disagrees with that logic. Now, some people might disagree that going first is better in Edison, and there's plenty of room for arguments to be made on that front, but my general feel and experience from playing both formats is that going first is kind of crazy in Edison format for like a retro format. So maybe I'm wrong, maybe people disagree. Let me know in the comments if you disagree. And we should also note the fact that I gave Tengu the edge in 2 out of 3 of these little categories here. Doesn't mean I think it's better. Like I mentioned before, the category of like decks and metagame and diversity is definitely like weighted the strongest for me, and I gave Edison the edge in that one. So don't read too much into that fact. Like I'm not saying one is better than the other. That's not even really the purpose of this video. The purpose of this video is to discuss like these individual qualities and the differences and how I feel about them. So like, please don't just like comment and call me an idiot for saying Tengu's better or whatever. That's not even what I meant, and it's not even like the goal of what I was trying to say. So like, just don't interpret it that way. Anyway, if you like this second discussion style video, be sure to give the video a like, drop a comment, subscribe to the channel. I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.